Provincetown, with a finger of land thrust far out to sea, is as sensitive as a barometer to the weather of change. Change is part of its essence. Mary Heaton Vorse.
I'm Greg Kendall. You're listening to Provincetown, a study in adaptive culture, an independent course designed for the Department of History under the care of Professor Jennifer Frank at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Thanks for listening. Built on sand and perched at the tip of Cape Cod, Provincetown is often referred to as Land's End. Depending on whom you talk to, it's known as a world-renowned art colony, a haven for authors and playwrights, or the quintessential New England fishing village. Some identify it as America's first gay-friendly resort town, chock-a-block with discos and drag queens, while others recognize it as the site of the Pilgrim's first landing in the New World. Perhaps you think of it as a tourist trap, catering to the saltwater taffy and trinket crowd, or a remarkable stretch of geography offering miles of protected, unbroken seashore with beaches bathed in enchanting, ever-shifting light. Or maybe, in this village constantly buffeted by the winds of change, you're one of the dwindling few who live there year-round, struggling to maintain a healthy and diverse community in an age of economic polarity. Well, in fact, Provincetown is all that and more. From Pamit Indians to English Puritans, from privateers and pirates to Portuguese fishermen, the mooncussers, beachcombers, rum runners, whalers, and queer folk, the artisan tradesmen, the rich and the poor, locals and washashores. These few miles of shifting sand are a testament to the spirit of change. I've stalked the streets and beaches of Provincetown for almost 30 years, fishing on its sandbars and drinking at its land bars. And I'm going to do my best, with some help from others, to paint a picture that hopefully captures a bit of the ineffable essence that defines this little corner of the world. Commercial Street runs along the water, ending where the Provincetown Harbor, Cape Cod Bay, and the Atlantic Ocean come together. If you look west over the harbor towards the lighthouses, you'll see the actual tip of Cape Cod, just like on the maps. It's pretty cool. The reason you know it's west, that is looking towards the mainland, is because it's where the sun sets. Otherwise, the end of the cape is a confusing curlicue. As it turns out, in the big picture, this tip wasn't Land's End until recently. Also, I hear that this particular part of the Upper Cape, the very end, is literally built on sand. I decided I needed to reach out to an expert for an explanation. Here's geologist Richard Little.
There's no bedrock. It is not like the coast of Maine and many other coastlines that have actual rock intact. I am clearing my throat. I am Richard Little. I am geologist at Greenfield Community College. I've studied beaches in many parts of the world, from California over to the Middle East. And this is an incredible beach here because this coastal situation is just so dramatic. It has erosion, it has deposition, and it has a lot of change. About 20,000 years ago, the last glacier extended all the way to the islands of Massachusetts, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket, and it extended out into George's Bank. So we have the so-called terminal moraine that was deposited once again about 20,000 years ago at the end of the last glacial age. From that point, the climate was warming and the ice melted back, and it stabilized again at Cape Cod. It builds the high spine of the Cape, really, and when you drive down there along Route 6, you're going along that high point over the so-called Sandwich Moraine. As you go further towards Provincetown, there's a prominent cliff that you will pass called Pilgrim Heights. It's about 60 feet high. It's, probably 4 or 5 miles from Provincetown itself, and that is the edge of the Cape from about 6,000 years ago. So the ocean had carved the Cape deposits back and back and back, and 6,000 years ago, that was the edge of the Cape outlined by that cliff. Now, Provincetown is not here yet, but once the Cape is at that point of Pilgrim Heights, the sand is able to move, pushed by the waves, beyond that erosional point of Pilgrim Heights and start to deposit the land that we now know as Provincetown. So the beach builds and builds and builds outward, pushed by the waves. Wind blows inland to create sand dunes, and the beach, pushed by the waves, continues to curve around into Provincetown Harbor, into Cape Cod Bay, and that protects Provincetown itself from the action of the storm waves.
Archaeologists suggest that the still evolving province lands were inhabited about 2,000 years ago. The natives of the Outer Cape were the Pamits, a group affiliated with the Nauset tribe. The Nausets, along with neighboring Wampanoag and Massachusetts Indians, called the New England shore Dawnland, and the inhabitants were the people of the first light. The native population of 16th century New England is estimated at 100,000 or more, with most living in shoreline communities. You heard that right. 100,000 Native Americans lived near or on the coast of New England in the 1500s, and for the most part, peacefully. But that was before the Europeans made their way to these waters. Talk about change. Legend has it that the Vikings made landfall in Provincetown around 1000 AD. There's a house in the West End called the Norse Wall Household that claims a stone structure dating from that visit lies beneath its foundation. It's not impossible. European explorers and fishermen soon followed the Vikings. Evidence of European trade with New England natives can be traced back to the late 15th century. Author Charles Mann's book, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, outlines in detail the tragic impact of European contact on the people of the first light. In 1523, Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, trying to find a new route to Asia for the French, rounded the Carolinas. Traveling north, he was surprised when he came upon a densely populated New England coastline. Docking in Narragansett Bay, near what is now Providence, Rhode Island, Verrazzano provides the first European account of the Dawnlanders. The natives weren't intimidated by Verrazzano's crew, and the Indians impressed the pallid, sickly Europeans with their strength, beauty, stature, and vitality. Compared to the Europeans, the Narragansett were totally buff. Verrazzano and his crew hung out and traded for 2 weeks with the friendly Narragansett, but the Italians' next stop on the Maine coast told a different story altogether. Because of their proximity to nearby Newfoundland's Grand Banks, a fishing grounds long popular with the Europeans, Maine's Abenaki tribe, unlike the Narragansett to the south, had plenty of experience with international interlopers. The Abenaki refused Verrazzano permission to land, wouldn't even touch the Europeans, instead exchanging goods back and forth on a rope over the water. 10 years before the Pilgrims washed ashore in Provincetown Harbor, in 1610, there were hundreds of vessels regularly working the coast of Newfoundland and New England, sailing under British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian flags, mostly fishing and trading, with the occasional kidnapping of natives, as souvenirs. It's well documented that at this time, New England was thickly settled with Native Americans. In 1605 and 1606, hotshot explorer Samuel de Champlain sailed into Cape Cod with designs on establishing a French base, but abandoned the idea because too many people already lived there. In 1607, a British team, well supplied, well organized, and with more people than the Mayflower, tried to establish a colony in Maine, only to be driven out by a large group of Indian fighters who killed 11 of the would-be colonists before sending them packing. It's clear that by the early 1600s, New England's large native population was well established, well armed, and thoroughly resistant to European settlement. So how, just a few years later, in 1620, did the Pilgrims stroll into Provincetown and soon after Plymouth without a fight? I don't know about you, but even as a kid growing up in Alabama, I learned about Squanto, the quote-unquote good Indian, who saved the Pilgrims by teaching them how to plant corn, and that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving. Well, if only it were so simple. Tisquantum was a Patuxet, part of the Wampanoag Confederation, from the area called Patuxet, in and around present-day Plymouth, Mass. In 1614, some weeks following a mostly cordial visit from Captain John Smith, that's right, Mr. Pocahontas himself, Tisquantum and several dozen other villagers accepted a friendly invitation to board a ship that was captained by one of Smith's subordinates, a Lieutenant Thomas Hunt. The unsuspecting natives boarded the ship. Well then, without provocation, the English sailors tried to cram the Indians into the ship's hold. The Patuxet resisted, and Hunt's men opened fire, creating what was deemed a great slaughter. Tisquantum and 19 others were forced below decks, and the ship made one more stop before returning to England, kidnapping 7 Nauset from Cape Cod. These offenses were Lieutenant Hunt's sole responsibility, as no one had ordered him to kill or kidnap natives. Following that, the Dawnlanders raged against Europeans. 2 years after Hunt's unilateral and deadly actions, in 1616, a French ship wrecked at the tip of Cape Cod at Land's End. The French crew tried to defend themselves on shore by constructing a weak fort of sticks and poles, but one at a time, the Nausets reduced their numbers to a handful, sending the captives to other native groups hungry for revenge against Europeans. It's recorded that before dying, one of the French prisoners warned the Nauset that God would punish them for their actions. After 5 years in England, Tisquantum returned to the shores of New England in 1619 on a ship piloted by Englishman Thomas Dermer to find what author Charles Mann describes an unimaginable scene. From southern Maine to Narragansett Bay, the coast was empty, utterly void. What had once been a line of busy communities was now a mass of tumble-down homes and fields overrun by blackberries. Scattered among the houses and fields were skeletons bleached by the sun. Slowly, Dermer's crew realized they were sailing along the border of a cemetery 200 miles long and 40 miles deep. Patuxet had been hit with a special force. Not a single person remained. Tisquantum's entire social world had vanished. In 3 short years, between 1616 and 1619, European disease had wiped out 90% of the people of the First Light. And that's how the Pilgrims were able to waltz into Provincetown without a fight. After a tortuous 2 months at sea, the leaky Mayflower lurched into the protected cove at Land's End on November 11, 1620, with 102 sickly passengers and a crew estimated at around 30 or 40. The passengers were a mix of Protestant separatists who refused to pledge allegiance to the Church of England, combined with some Anglican or secular colonial adventurers and tradesmen who were looking for a better life. They were uneasy shipmates, to say the least. The roughly 40 separatists, who called themselves saints, were a sanctimonious lot in the eyes of the majority of the passengers, who were dubbed strangers. But while still moored in Provincetown Harbor, before stepping foot onto the sands of today's West End, the rival factions put aside their differences to draft and sign the Mayflower Compact, a covenant of laws and agreements designed to maintain order in a potentially anarchic situation. They had a compelling reason to create this seminal constitution. By landing in Massachusetts, they were beyond the reach of English law. The voyage had been commissioned by London's Virginia Company, with the Chesapeake Bay the target destination, but navigational missteps and a shortage of supplies forced the Mayflower to drop anchor in Provincetown Harbor, where the English had no claim. It must have been nerve-wracking for the sick and exhausted Pilgrims to gaze upon the shores of this strange place, where they weren't supposed to be. A couple of days after anchoring, the mission's military advisor, Miles Standish, led an armed expedition down the beach and into the woods, and eventually they stumbled upon a fresh water source, now called Pilgrim Springs. Nearby, the desperate, hungry watch-ashores found a deserted Indian encampment where they ransacked homes and raided burial sites, searching for hidden food. Uncovering a stash of corn the Pamets had hidden for the winter, the army made off with 10 bushels of maize. Some of it they carried in a large metal kettle they'd also stolen. The saints chalked up their luck in finding the corn to God's good providence, although military man Standish was a firm stranger. Some weeks after, Standish and his men encountered a small band of Indians in today's Wellfleet, a bit down Cape from Provincetown. They had a skirmish without injuries. In the end, it took but one dispiriting month for the Pilgrims to decide that foraging and grave robbing amongst hostile natives at Land's End wasn't a winning formula for winter survival, so they weighed anchor for Plymouth. Although 5 of the original 102 passengers died either during the voyage from Plymouth or while in Provincetown Harbor, including Dorothy, the 23-year-old wife of Protestant leader William Bradford, who was informed following an expedition ashore that his young bride had drowned in the harbor. The Mayflower carried to Plymouth the first child of Pilgrims born in Massachusetts. Peregrine White was delivered aboard the ship on November 20, 1620, to live a long 84 years in the new colony. With the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth Colony, Cape Cod went on being the Cape Cod it had been since the 1500s, a way stop for fishermen, pirates, smugglers, and privateers, a haven for outsiders who exchanged rum for venison and corn with the natives, and engaging in all kinds of mischief. Renegade Europeans would set up camp for the summer on this unclaimed strip of land teeming with fish, shellfish, and whales. Nicknamed Helltown, it was the perfect spot to fill up a ship's hold without braving the Grand Banks, and a great place to trade in all manner of contraband, unencumbered by British law. As some colonists grew restless in Plymouth, they ventured back to the Cape in the mid and late 1600s, settling in Nauset, Billingsgate, and Pamet, now, respectively, Eastham, Wellfleet, and Truro, the 3 towns preceding Provincetown on the way to Land's End. The upstanding citizens of those towns reported often to England's General Court about the wild goings-on at the end of the Cape, and by 1714, the court had heard enough. It was decreed that, although separate, the province lands would fall under the jurisdiction of Truro, with an unfunded mandate to procure and support a learned Orthodox minister. To pay the preacher, Truro was tasked with collecting weekly taxes from Provincetown's fishermen. One can only imagine how that went over in a town of squatters, rum runners, and itinerant sailors. A year after the decree, in 1715, Truro's frustrated leaders begged England to either declare the province lands part of Truro or make it separate altogether in order to know how to act in regard to some persons. Cape Cod was finally incorporated as Provincetown in 1727. Throughout the 1700s, until after the War of 1812, Provincetown was populated in fits and starts. The French and British were constantly at each other's throats, and Land's End was particularly vulnerable to French invasion after the King George's War of 1744 to 1748, because the French were pissed. Because New England's fishermen had captured the main French port of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, near Newfoundland, for the British in 1745, and the French threatened revenge. Trade with Newfoundland and the West Indies was thoroughly disrupted, so Provincetown's residents cleared out until the end of the French-Indian War in 1763. The 1764 census doesn't even mention Provincetown, but from that point forward, New England and Provincetown rebounded, laying the groundwork for the 19th century's glory days of the fishing and whaling industries. But first, there's the American Revolution to be addressed. The 1770s found Provincetown populated with 20 houses, 36 families and 205 souls. But the coming revolution once again nearly emptied the small village as the British anchored a fleet in and around the harbor, establishing a base of naval operations, including the noted English frigate Somerset. Needless to say, the robust commerce and fishing was severely disrupted when the Somerset was run aground by a French warship in 1778. Yes, the French were now colonial allies. It's confusing. But anyway, the British supership Somerset was stranded on the Peaked Hills bars, and while a local continental militia marched the survivors to Boston, the remaining denizens of Provincetown and Truro swept the ship like a bluefish blitz, stripping it from stern to bow, picking it clean of anything of value. But it was a short-lived celebration, as Provincetown was deserted at the end of the war. However, better days, much better days, were to come. The Provincetown population and fishing industry came back strong after the War for Independence, with the 1790 census showing 454 residents. At least 30 ships sailed from the harbor to collect a reported 11,000 quintals of cod. With a quintal representing 100 pounds, that's over 1 million pounds of codfish. The spoils of war that benefited New England and Provincetown directly included the right to fish waters formerly under British control, most importantly, the fertile seas off the coast of Newfoundland, including the Grand Banks. The opening of these fishing grounds provided an enormous boost to the post-war fishing industry. For instance, in 1807, a single fishery on Bell Island in the Maritimes provided employment for 225 Provincetown fishermen, producing 33,000 quintals of cod. But that same year, in the run-up to the War of 1812, disaster struck in the form of the Embargo Act of 1807, prohibiting any and all exports from the United States. President Thomas Jefferson was trying to pressure the still warring British and French to respect the new nation, but Provincetown paid dearly for the action because the town's newly vital fishing business was dry docked as a result of the embargo. During the War of 1812, Provincetown was, once again, occupied by British forces, but this time, instead of deserting the town, the people of Land's End made the best of a bad situation. Wounded by the embargo and suspicious of the new American government, trade with British officers was commonplace, with locals selling supplies in exchange for gold. The town's remote location and tolerance for unconventional behavior allowed for this to happen, as it had before and as it would continue well into the future. With the war years finally over, Provincetown was eager to capitalize on peace. A recipe for success with all the ingredients was at hand. They had a protected harbor, there were expanded international fishing and whaling grounds, improved vessels and fishing techniques, increased local salt production, wharf development, and government subsidies. As prices for whale products steadily increased through the first half of the 19th century, whaling kept pace. Whale oil was indispensable for lamps and candle making. Whalebone, the plastic of the sea, was used in the era's very popular corsets and other clothing, as well as for umbrellas and toys. Ambergris, a waxy lump from the whale's digestive system, was also valuable as a perfume fixative. All in all, whaling in the early to mid-1800s was very profitable. Provincetown experienced significant growth in this period, with the population rising by 500%. Cape Cod's whaling schooners were smaller and more nimble than the large New Bedford-style barks designed for 4 or 5 year-long whaling voyages. The schooner captains usually kept their whaling trips limited to 6 months, and many of Provincetown's ships could be outfitted for either whaling or fishing, depending on what the sea had to offer at a given time. This flexibility was key to Provincetown's success. While some whalers sailed as far south as the Falklands or north to the Arctic, most boats from Land's End worked in the relatively nearby waters of the Atlantic, off the Hatteras Grounds, or Labrador, Cape Verde, and the Azores. Captives would set sail with a skeleton crew and fill their ranks with cheaper Portuguese labor hired in the Azores, an activity that would ultimately impact Provincetown's future. Commercial whaling reached its high-water mark in Provincetown in 1860, later than most New England seaports, and a gradual decline followed, attributed in part to the discovery of petroleum oil in Pennsylvania in 1857, and the Civil War, and mainly a dwindling whale stock. Problems from overfishing became apparent in the second half of the 19th century, with the whale slowly going the way of the buffalo. At the same time, the buffalo was going the way of the buffalo. And just as slowly, and just as surely, Provincetown's Yankees weren't far behind. I talked to Rex McKenzie, Provincetown's current harbor master, and he sums up what happened as high-profit whaling declined through the late 19th century.
The thing about fishing is that it takes advantage of what is before it at the time. So that when whaling started to fade out, that sounds like, oh, the demise of the fishing fleet. Well, it wasn't. The Portuguese guys that had been working on the whaling boats would leave here in Nantucket or New Bedford or what have you. They'd head over to the Azores to pick up crew. And they'd go do their whaling thing for a year or two, come back. Well, the Portuguese guys, some of them settled here. And when the decline in whaling caused people to want to sell their boats off, the Portuguese guys were far enough along that they could now pick up these boats for cheap and started going after different species.
That's Provincetown, always changing with the changing times. By the end of the 19th century, ice had frozen out salt as demand for fresh fish increased along with the East Coast population. The railroad was introduced to Provincetown in 1873. Here's Harbor Master Rex McKenzie again.
A lot of change happened very quickly and the product got better. You could get product fresher, faster to market, and that certainly had an effect on it.
Nearby George's Banks replaced the Grand Banks off Newfoundland to satisfy customers hungry for the catch of the day. Clipper ships were developed to speed product to port, as the first boat to the docks commanded the highest prices. Fresh cod and mackerel, halibut, haddock, and herring dominated the trade, with Provincetown's liners using Boston's hub to market their wares to New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Provincetown's Yankees created the infrastructure, the banks and wharves, chandleries, blacksmith shops, general stores, and cold storage, but the fishing industry was ceded quickly to the Portuguese by the end of the 19th century. Why? Poverty, compulsory military service, regular drought, and the desire to find family already settled in New England are some of the reasons for increased Azorean Portuguese immigration to Provincetown beginning in the 1870s. The hardworking islanders were naturally drawn to fishing, as that's mostly what brought their people to Land's End in the first place. Meanwhile, after the Civil War at the turn of the century, Yankee kids were looking elsewhere for a living. There's no definitive answer as to why that happened, but I get it. I had a recent conversation with a middle-aged plumber who bemoaned his son's desire for a degree in liberal arts, while steady employment in the trades is at his fingertips. Such are the costs of early education. It breeds dreams of opportunity, and who wants to do what their old man did anyway? Some, maybe not many, especially if it's involving slaving from dawn to midnight, soaking wet, hauling nets, and pulling lines on a deck slick with fish guts, heaving across roiling waves on a boat that's seen better days, with Poseidon's fist banging on the hull, knock, knock, knocking on the door to Davy Jones' locker. Not fishing for a living makes sense if that's not your thing, and if there are other options. So the Portuguese accepted the still profitable mantle of Provincetown's fishing industry, signaling yet another sea change at Land's End. Fishing continued as the area's chief economic concern, but the industry, already faltering, was dealt a major blow by a brutal 1898 nor'easter. Some say the storm, named the Portland Gale for the steamer that carried 176 people to watery graves off the coast of Cape Cod. That storm wiped out half of the 50 wharves lining Provincetown Harbor and sunk or beached an alarming number of ships. The devastation was harrowing. But local leaders had reportedly already contemplated conversion of the town's economic focus to tourism. And a year later, painter and instructor Charles Hawthorne arrived from Long Island to open an art school that would forever alter the course of Provincetown's destiny.